The first thing is this. The Israelites said, we don't need this law. The book of Judges describes this in great detail. There's a refrain that is sprinkled throughout the book of Judges. It says this, in those days there was no king and the people, each person did what was right in his own eyes. It's a way of saying everyone got to decide for themselves what was truth. Everyone got to decide for themselves what was right and what was wrong. And as liberating as that might sound, the picture that Judges paints is absolute chaos. Violence, hostility, people turning on each other, people killing each other. When each person did what was right in their own eyes, when they discarded the law of God and each person decided right and wrong for themselves, it tore the fabric of the people apart. I couldn't help but think of that when you look at our contemporary culture today. What's the refrain that we hear so often? Well, we all have to decide for ourselves what's right and wrong. We get to decide truth for ourselves. And it's a way of saying that we, each individual, is autonomous. We have our own power. And that sounds liberating to some. But when you watch what's happening in our culture, I believe we're looking at the outcome of this way of thinking. Because sooner or later what happens is my version of truth is going to conflict with your version of truth. And we see this happening all the time in the streets when protesters rise up against one another and the violence that takes place. What is it? It's each group saying, my way of truth, my understanding of right and wrong. And what happens when you even get literally two groups of people with competing ideas of right and wrong and they meet in the streets? What happens? They don't say, well, we respect your idea and that's yours and you respect. No, it's a clash. I think that's maybe a metaphor for the bigger picture of what's happening. When truth is left up for grabs, when we each get to decide for ourselves right and wrong, I believe it tears at the fabric of our culture. Some of you are hearing this and you're agreeing. And you're nodding your heads and in your heart you're saying, yeah, that's right. And what we really need to do is we need to get back to traditional morality. We need to get back to the way things once were. We need to reinstate the 10 Commandments and we need to put prayer back in the schools and so on and so forth. And if that's what you're thinking, I understand where you're coming from, but I want to caution you because the second thing that happened in Israel was really exactly that. You had a group of people that said, we are never going to let this destruction happen again. We're going to be serious about keeping God's law. We're going to be serious about keeping His commands. And so what did they do? They formed rules to help them keep God's commands. And then they needed rules to help them keep the rules to help them keep God's commands. We know those groups today, that group today, especially as the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were really serious about trying to be obedient to God. But what happened is that it created tremendous pride. Put the focus all on human ability. We can do this. We can fix the problems. We can be moral. We can be good enough. Now listen, some of you are familiar with this because maybe some of you grew up in this. And Christianity felt like it was all about keeping the rules. It felt like it was all about what can you do and not do on Sundays, for example. What's the code that good Christian people live up to? And you know, pretty soon that creates a hierarchy. Get the good people at the top, medium, not so good. And you know then pretty soon the people at the top look down on the people at the bottom. Oh, they're not as good as I am. Happened in Israel, happens today. Now that brings us to Pentecost. Because I want you to notice in verses 2 and 3, all the disciples are together in one place. And the whole place is filled with the tongues of fire that come down and the mighty rushing wind. Luke is being very careful in the way that he's describing this because what he's really doing is he's calling our attention back to Mount Sinai. He wants us to think about the first Pentecost. He wants us to think about the first day that God's presence came and descended among His people. Because Luke is saying God is redoing what happened the first time. Why not? Why aren't the people afraid of God's presence? Why aren't they fearful that God's presence, His holy presence, will destroy unholy people? And the answer is that 50 days before this event in Luke 2, 50 days earlier, God's presence came down again. 50 days earlier, God led the ultimate exodus. 50 days earlier, Jesus comes and He leads His people out of slavery because God's presence comes down on Jesus Christ on the cross and destroys not Jesus' sin, but our sin. 50 days prior, God's presence consumed the evil and the sin and the unrighteousness in His people. And practically speaking, what that means is now God's presence is not something that will destroy His people. God's presence is now able to come and dwell among His people. And that's what's happening at Pentecost. But more than that, we read that there's this mighty wind. It says in verse 2, it's a sound of a violent wind. Again, Luke is being so deliberate with his words here. We read wind and we think about, the trees were blowing like crazy outside, but that's not the word Luke uses here. The word Luke uses here for wind is only used maybe 2 or 3 other times in the New Testament, and it doesn't refer to a meteorological phenomenon. There was another word for that. The word that's used here is the word that communicates God's life-giving breath coming among His people. What Luke is saying is that the Holy Spirit is the presence of God coming and breathing new life into spiritually dead people. To put it a little bit differently, the Israelites of the Old Testament, people apart from God, were spiritually unable to live the life that God wanted. They were spiritually unable. They were incapable of the obedience that God desires from His people. But now the Holy Spirit comes and the presence of God comes among His people and gives them and makes them alive. He breathes new life into them, and that's what He does with us. When we talk about what it means to be a Christian, what we are saying is that it's the Holy Spirit who comes upon us and breathes new life into spiritually dead people. He reinvigorates you. He makes you a new person. He takes your heart that otherwise would be cold and indifferent to God and changes it. He takes your old heart that struggles with sin and is dead in sin and wants nothing more than to live for self and says, I'm going to make you new again. That's what the Holy Spirit does. That's what's happening at Pentecost. Rabbi